Well, welcome, trustees, to the Administry training today. I'm glad you're joining us and looking through a lot of information that will be good for you to know. Some of it will be new, some of it won't be new. And for you, Administry group, the finance group, you're probably going to learn a lot about trustees and why they need the budget they need. So let's get started. If you want to read about the trustees inside our good book of discipline, inside there, paragraph 258.3 deals with the discipline of the local church trustees. Now we're going to transition inside of this from the local church trustees, how the conference trustees have an effect on you. So we'll get to that part and help you better understand that. Paragraph 2525 and 2551 also deal with the trustees of the local church. The job of the trustees is really simple. It's just the keeper of God's house. We're the agent of physical resources and legal matters. We receive direction and we're responsible for the incorporation of the local church. We maintain adequate insurance. We oversee, maintain, supervise all local church property. You can't rule property out. It belongs to the trustees because they are, as we said, the legal body of the church. They have to report annually to charge conference, and they receive and administer all gifts. We'll talk about that because sometimes that one gets a little confusing. They ensure the updating of property. Nobody wants to go in a messy, junky-looking place that's unsafe. And would we really want to represent God's house looking that bad? We want it nice. We work with the pastor on the use of the property. The pastor is appointed by the conference to be the United Methodist presence in the church and is reportable to the superintendents and bishop for the property. And so we work with the pastor being sure that we're living into all the things the discipline calls us to do. We get to submit a budget request because we've got to take care of all this property and insure it and make sure all those things are happening. And we've got to be sure that the property is accessible and that we are able to lead inside of the accessibility to the church and the parsonage and other buildings, as well as being accountable to the charge conference and the church council for all the actions that we take. The trustees' chair's job is to guide the work of the board of trustees. Please do not become a lone ranger. You can't do all this by yourself because if you do, you're going to find yourself being thought of as the person that won't let us do what we want to do. And you'll be taking all the blame, all the problems upon yourself. That's why the discipline gives you 9 other people to work with you. You provide advice and direction. You should know what's going on. You should not elect a brand new trustee to be the chair, simply because you're going to find that even though you know how to handle buildings and you may be a wonderful building superintendent, you don't know all that happens inside the discipline in relation to the church and the church property. You've got to maintain close communication with the pastor. You do know that the pastor is the one that says who can use the church and who cannot use the church, especially from the pulpit. So we as the trustees can't run around having a calendar and allowing whoever we want to come in the church. We've got to be sure that it is a United Methodist presence being able to come into that church, one that lives inside the ideals that we believe in. Now the trustee chair also serves on the church council or a responsible person that they appoint to go. But you are on the church council. Now the trustees relate to a group of people. They relate first to the charge conference. That's the primary governing body of the church. So it's in charge conference we borrow money, we approve buildings, we approve additions, renovations. All those kind of things are approved in charge conference. The church council to whom they relate also plan and coordinate and implement church programs for ministry. So if somebody wants to do some type of ministry, and let's say that we're going to have on the 3rd floor of our building, we're going to have a ministry that requires a person in a wheelchair to be able to get there, and all we've got is steps going up, then it's the trustees' responsibility to figure out either how we get an elevator in, we get some way to get them up there, or we move them to the first floor where they can easily get in. We must be accessible. They're responsible to the Staff Parish Relations Committee because we have the parsonages, we have the moving, We've got hired staff, building and equipment needs. We need to be sure that we as trustees make sure that all our employees, lay or clergy, have what they need to do the work that they're called to do. And then we relate to the Finance Committee, where we also help raise, manage, and disperse the funds. We've got to be a part of that because we've got to know what is our job in raising so that we can share what we're going to need so that we're sure that the funds are dispersed in the way that we want our budget dispersed. Now, the trustee members have got some requirements. They've got to be of legal age. Now, that's kind of odd sounding in the church. We always want to be inclusive of everybody, and yet we come back and say trustees have got to be of legal age, and that's only for one reason. They must be able to contract. All contracts, all incorporation, which is a contract, is done by people that are of legal age. Now, we've also named in the discipline that there shall be no fewer than 3 and no more than 9 members. Now, you may say, we only got 2 members in our church. Well, guess what? At least 2/3 must be professing members of the United Methodist Church, of which 1/3 shall be a lay woman, 1/3 will be lay men. The other third can be filled up by the lay men or women, but a minimum of 1/3 men, 1/3 women, and at least 2/3 professing members of the United Methodist Church. So you only got 2 members in your church. Now what do? We go find another United Methodist and say, hey, you're on the charge with us. Would you mind serving on our trustees so that we can live within the discipline and have enough people to do the work we're called to do? With one catch. The chairperson must be a member of that local church. So we can't let the person we bring in from another church be the chair. We want our chair to come from our membership. And no pastor is a voting member unless elected as a member. Now that's different than the Finance Committee that we talked about earlier. The pastor is automatically on the Finance Committee with vote and voice. The pastor is not automatically a voting member, a member of the trustees unless elected. So we want to be really careful in our church conference where we elect our leadership that we elect the pastor as a member of the trustees so that it becomes easier to be sure that we're living into all the United Methodist beliefs and the things that we need to do, that there doesn't become an argument over the pastor attending, trustees having private meetings, things like that. We just don't do that, folks. We need to be sure that our pastor is elected as a member. Now, is that a requirement? No. But it's a good practice for your pastor to be a voting member of the trustees. And you have to do that through the nominations and through the election process. Now, remember the trustees' election is a 3-year term. So our boards are divided into 3 classes, and it makes sense if you think about this. To start with, there's a class that serves 3 years, there's a class that serves 2 years, and there's a class that serves 1 year. That gets us started in the year that we're organized as United Methodist Church. Now then, when the ones that were elected for a 1-year term go off, you elect 3 more people to come on that have a 3-year term. So you see that 3, 2, and 1 is only effective in the first year of trustees. Going forward, everybody's elected to a 3-year term. And then we have that consistency of change. That way we never find ourselves with a committee that doesn't know how to turn the water off on a cold day when the water's going to freeze, or how to call to get a repairman in to repair something, or what's the layout of the electrical plant of the church. We always want somebody that's familiar with the contractual arrangements and the property that we have, and that's how we do that with that 3-year term. Now, the charge conference will fill any vacancies that occur in a class. So let's say that a person in the class of 2022 moves, and so they're not there. So a person's elected to come into the class of 2022, and they'll only have 1 year. The year will change in 2023, let's say. And so they'll only have 1 year to serve, and then the next class is electing 3. So you don't move people up, move people down. You don't move them around. They're elected by the charge conference to fill a specific place. Now, anything wrong with them getting elected for another 3-year term on the next election? No, nothing wrong with that. They can get their own 3-year term. They're completing the term of the person that left. And it's very important to know that the board elects their own officers at the first meeting each year. Now, that first meeting each year is important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the board elects their officers. So nominations committee, you can't say who's going to be chair, vice chair, and secretary. It comes from the trustees themselves. So we've got to remember, according to paragraph 2530, mark that one down, that the first meeting of the trustees must be held within 30 days of the beginning of the year. Our years begin January 1. So within 30 days, we must have the first meeting of the trustees. This works out really well when we're incorporated, and I'll explain more of that to you in just a minute. We've got to elect, in that meeting, we've got to elect the chairperson, the vice chair, the secretary, and any other offices that we think we need, like a vice chairperson, like we may want a treasurer to work with the treasurer of the church. The trustee treasurer may work with the treasurer of the church, not to write checks, not to sign checks, not to do any of that, but to see that our financial obligations are being met inside of the finance committee and the admin council inside of there. So we can elect any officers we think we need. We may need an officer to oversee charitable gifts that are coming in, because we may be making a big push on getting people to remember their church and their will. And so we may elect somebody in charge of doing that. So we can elect who we want to. The piece we've got to remember is that the chairperson and the vice chairperson cannot be of the same class. If you elect the chair and the vice chair out of class 3, 4th year from now, you're not going to have anybody that knows how to be a chair or a vice chair. So you probably want to elect the vice chair that's in the second group of 3 years, and the chair that's in their last year of their 3-year time frame. That way they had a year to learn, a year to practice, and a year to be. And we don't end up having a trustee be the chair forever that becomes what's perceived as the controller of the church. So we want to be careful with what we're doing. Remember, we want to be accountable and transparent in all that we do. Trustees should meet at least quarterly. How do you take care of God's house? How do you take care of God's money that you're charged with if you meet once a year? But the discipline says you're required to meet annually. Good practice says meet quarterly. And quite honestly, if I'm building a building, if I'm going through a renovation project, if I'm trying to raise money to pay for a building, I'm going to meet more than that. So I want to be careful in calling my meetings. More about that in just a minute. And then you have incorporation responsibilities. When a church is incorporated, you incorporate the trustees, not the admin council, not the programmatic committees. You incorporate inside of your legal arm of the church. More to come on that. A majority of the trustees constitute a quorum. That's different than in all the other committees in the United Methodist Church. And again, it's because we're the legal arm. Whoever's present is the quorum in finance, pastor parish, all of those. The trustees, I must have a quorum, more than half of the people to do business. We divide them into groups for their 3 years, 2 years, and 1 year, but we may also divide them into subcommittees, like who's responsible for the buildings, who's responsible for the grounds, who's responsible for the bequest, the equipment, the parsonage, the rental building that we have downtown. That just keeps one person from having to do everything. The chairperson or the pastor are the only two that can call the meeting. Look at paragraph 2532. The chairperson or the pastor. So that doesn't leave it in the hands of lay or clergy to make decisions when we're going to meet. It leaves it in the hands of the lay or clergy, so that we live into the legal requirements of the discipline and the law of the land. Supervision, oversight, and care of all real property and equipment belongs to the trustees. Insuring your property is your responsibility. Now that becomes dangerous, because you think about it. If you fail to insure your property properly, there's too many propers in that. If you insure your property properly, then replacement in the event of a fire or earthquake or something like that, hurricane comes along, then you could be held liable for negligently doing your job. So you want to be careful. Look at that property, and we do have a property and casualty insurance company that's owned by the conference, managed by your conference trustees, that we hope you all will be a part of. The properties used with the pastor's approval. You cannot, as a committee, go out and let anybody use the property without the pastor saying, okay. The pastor is appointed to the pulpit of that church, which in fact then governs who can use the property. So we want to be careful there. We need to have an annual inspection of the parsonage. That's not to go in and see if we're keeping house nice and neat. That's going in to see if we see leaks in the roof. You know, a lot of times pastors are kind of hesitant to say your parsonage has a leak, or your parsonage, the floors really looks bad. They don't want to tell you your building looks bad. But if you as the trustees go in and you say, oh my gosh, I would not live in a parsonage that has worn out linoleum in the kitchen like that. We need to replace it. Then that puts the pastor in the ability to know that you're going to see those things and how we bring these things up. So you want to be sure that you do an annual inspection of the parsonage with the pastor-parish relations chair, and make sure that the parsonage is a place that you would want to live in. If you don't want to live in it, do you really think your pastor wants to live in it? Quite honestly, no. Quite honestly, no. But we want to be sure that it's nice. We receive and administer all bequests to the local church. That's where this gets confusing, because there's some trustees, they want to take over all the money coming in and tell you how to spend it. Well, no, that's not your job. Trustees, the only thing you get to do is if there is an inheritance that comes to the church, it comes to the trustees. Now, why? Think about it. An inheritance is a legal document that comes and is received legally by the church. So we have to have it come to the legal arm of the church. The trustees then can pass it off to the finance committee, pass it off to a memorial committee. It can pass it wherever it wants to be administered, but it must be received by the trustees of the local church. And then you need to do an accessibility audit every year. God's house should be open to everybody regardless. And you can put anything else you want to behind it, as far as I'm concerned. Regardless. If a person's in a wheelchair, they ought to be able to get into that sanctuary without worrying about how do I get up 44 steps before I walk in the sanctuary. So that's what an accessibility audit is. Is it protecting the people that are using the house of God? Is it protecting the church from getting sued because of slips and falls? Do we have the things in place like they need to be to provide a safe house that God lives in? We ought to have a building use policy. If we allow people to use our churches, and we want people to use our churches, what better way than to invite in groups that advocate for things that we believe in, for them to come to our church and use our church? Then we kind of get working with them, and we begin to do more ministry because we have other people working on that. There's a Word document on the website that will allow you to go in. Now again, don't type your name on the top of it and take it, because there's some blanks in there. You got to fill in the blanks. Make it your policy. Make sure that if somebody from the outside's coming in, that you've got a certificate of insurance. They need to bring their own liability coverage in if they're going to use our building. If they're going to bring equipment in, they need to have their equipment insured, and we need a certificate of insurance that says so. We need a usage policy for all groups, whether they're internal or external. If I call you from the conference office and say, hey, we'd love to have a training in your church, I need to sign a building use policy with your church so that if we mess something up, if something happens, it doesn't have to be, oh, they were nice, they paid for it. It's, oh, they messed it up, they fixed it because that's what they agreed to in the beginning. We need to be sure that our groups have signage that gets people to the right place. We just don't need people roaming all over the building, because their statement's going to be, that's the most unfriendly place I've ever been. There wasn't anybody that I could see to ask where to go. Well, it is a Tuesday night. Nothing's really happening on Tuesday night except choir practice. But if I got good signage that says that this group is meeting here, there, or yonder, it just makes it more friendly. We want to be careful of what we're doing. There ought to be limits of insurance, and the certificates need to be updated annually. If you're not on the conference insurance, then you have to name us as additional insured on that insurance, and you have to be certain that you're meeting certain levels of coverage. This protects you from things happening in the church. More importantly, as long as all the other churches have that, it protects you also. Because when a lawsuit's filed, it's filed against the church, the district, and the conference. Well, think about it. If something happens inside your district, you got 3 chances of getting sued. If it happens in another district, you got 2 chances of getting sued. If it happens where there is no district, can't imagine where that is, but you got 1 chance of getting sued. You're going to get sued for things that happen, and you weren't even there to scrape the ice off the steps where somebody fell and got hurt. First of all, shame on us for letting somebody get hurt. But second of all, for not having enough insurance to take care of their medical bills. So we want to be certain that we have the right limits of liability insurance, that we segregate groups to specific areas. We don't need everybody roaming through the children's area, through the daycare area. We do have the responsibility through safe sanctuaries to be sure that the people that are supposed to be in there are in there, and the ones that are not are not. And you've got the right number of people in the meetings. Be careful. And the opening and the closing of facilities with groups. I make it a practice on your conference property that only a conference employee can host a meeting on campus. Now that doesn't mean you can't bring your admin council for a big training session and use the Wilson Annex. That means that somebody from the conference office comes, unlocks the building, lets you in. When y'all finish, goes in, makes sure everything's back where it's supposed to be, and locks the building. So you see, you don't want to just toss everybody a key and say, hey, here's the code or here's the key, come use our building. That's not what we want to do. We want to be sure that we're there to open and close the building for all groups that are using it, so that if something is wrong or unsafe, we find it and we correct it. That's the purpose of that opening and closing of the facilities, and that is inside of your building use policy. You got to meet the standards for your property and casualty. Paragraph 2533 talks about that. And also the slides, as you look at the slides, you'll see that there are things that if you're not in the conference plan, that you do have to get that deck page with the conference name on it and provide the minimum bonding for your treasurer. It's your job to be sure that the treasurer is bonded. Years ago, we used to have a conference bond, and everybody paid the magic $7. I know y'all remember the $7 on that because some of y'all still send it in. We got to be sure that we bond our treasurer. The discipline says the treasurer shall be bonded, and we have the bond inside of the property and casualty trust. So, if you're not a part of the property and casualty trust, make sure you got a bond on that treasurer. It's your responsibility, and I would suggest a position bond is the best, because anybody handling money is then bonded, not just the treasurer. We have a position bond in the conference property and casualty trust. I really think you should do that inside of yours if you're not with us. Check your property values. Oh, have we had some problems out there. We've had churches insured for half, 30% of what it costs to rebuild them. And where we really get confused is we'll have a really nice building and insure it for $3 million. Oh, that'll be plenty of money to put that back. Do you have a pipe organ? How many pianos do you have? Have you got handbells? Those are expensive items. What about stained glass? One of my favorite things when I pull up to a church is to look at their windows, because every window is different. Every church has different windows, whether they're solid or they're stained glass or ever how they're done. But you talking about expensive. Now you are going to spend some money there. And then what about the artwork or the historic items inside that church? We've got one church that's got a mural on the wall, and that must be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 feet wide and 15, 16 feet tall that's historic. That thing's worth more than about a third of the building. And if that building burned down, how would you replace it? Well, you couldn't replace it, but you might get a new one painted. But are you going to have enough money to do it? Did you have enough insurance? Think about your vehicles. Think about your contents. This day and age, think about your IT hardware. and all of those virtual items that we have to be able to do church in this day and age. And then how about cyber coverage? We can get hacked pretty quickly. Many of you have made calls saying that you got an email from the bishop that says, I need a $25 gift certificate. Would you send this to me? And y'all immediately call and say, I know that's not our bishop. Something's wrong. But do you have security if some cyber attack is launched and your bank account gets zapped out of all its money? Got to think about that. So make sure your values are right. If you add all these things together, you may find out that $3 million policy on what you thought was plenty for that building really needs to be $6 or $7 million. We've learned that. We had the oldest African American church in the New Albany district to burn. They were insured for about 1/3 of the value. They worried about the premiums. They thought they had enough to cover the building, and when that building burned, they had to put up a much smaller unit of a building than they had to begin with because of the funds that they had. Because remember, if it burns down and you don't have enough insurance, then you've got to raise the money to build it. And I'm going to tell you, it's very hard to raise money for a church that's burned to the ground, and I'm trying to rebuild it when the members are going to church elsewhere. It's just not a good case. The easiest is to have the right coverage, and be sure you've got workers' comp. If somebody gets hurt on your property as a worker, you need to be able to pay for their medical bills. You need to be certain that your workers are covered, and be absolutely certain if you're doing contracts for repairmen or for any of those type things, people that come in and do work, that they have workers' comp. Because under the workers' comp law, if they don't have workers' comp and they're on your property doing work, you've got to pay workers' comp on them. So remember that part of it as you think about these insured values. That's a big part, and you can see that. We had a situation in a daycare that was run by a church that a little child stepped in an ant bed and was eaten up by ants. And we didn't have the right insurance to cover everybody. That was not a good day. I'll tell you more about what happened on that in a minute. Be sure you perform the right risk management. You have got to manage your risk. What do you need to look for? Who reports what where? Who can help you do that? And that's what our risk managers do that manage our plan. Arthur Gallagher Group manages our insurance program that we own. Please hear that clearly. This is not an Arthur Gallagher policy. This is a Mississippi Conference United Methodist Church policy that is managed by the Arthur J. Gallagher Company under the direction of the Mississippi Conference Trustees. It's yours. Call them, use them. They'll help you figure out what you need to do. They will provide you a lot of different things. Now, if I think about a risk management process, there's a 6-step process I need to follow. I need to identify the hazards. Is there water coming underneath the door when it rains? Is there rotten wood around a window? Are there children's rooms or vulnerable adult rooms that have no windows in the doors? Assess the hazards. Management has to be committed to eliminate the risk. We've got to eliminate all the risk we can by implementing controls, whether it's engineering, whether it's administrative, whether it's inspections, whatever it is, we've got to mitigate our hazards. We keep up a claim history because we need to know the last time the tires were replaced on the vans. If somebody doesn't look and see their bald tires and they're driving down the road and have a blowout, imagine what that can do. You need to monitor the results of your inspections and your claim history, and you need to do it again and again and again. We call that RAD, review, analyze, and do. You've got to keep working to be sure your property is properly taken care of. Why we need self-inspections? Because there's poor walking surfaces. Have you ever walked around and just looked down the whole time you're walking to see how the concrete is? If I've got to look down to make sure I'm not tripping on broken concrete, then there's certainly going to be people walking around that's new to the place that's going to trip on it because they're not looking down. You need to be looking down when you're inspecting that property. Do we have roof leaks? Did the roof leaks cause water damage that caused mold, that caused mildew? Are there openings inside of our attic where bats are finding places to live, and squirrels and raccoons and all the other little critters that need a place to live are getting into our building and then totally making a mess? Is there surge suppression for all our electrical equipment? We saw a picture of a playground one day that had a microwave sitting on the playhouse. We thought, well, isn't that cute? They took an old broken down microwave, put it out there for the kids to act like they had a microwave. Well, we looked a little closer and we learned that microwave was plugged in out in the middle of the yard where it was raining with an electric cord running to the building where the kids were playing. Lord have mercy, was that an element to worry about? Surge protectors wouldn't even help there. We got to be sure that there is a building usage parsonage, because otherwise a third party who's injured in a building, if they don't have a usage policy and the people that are using it are not following it, then you're responsible. You're the trustees. You're the legal arm. The cornerstone of safety and risk management efforts for a religious organization is its facility management. And if you're a small church that can't hire that to be done, then somebody on the trustees needs to be responsible. Because remember, if they're responsible, there's really no theirs. Or if they're supposed to do this, or they're checking this, or they have it covered, the theirs and the theys are the people you don't name. Name somebody that's responsible for self-inspections and the reporting. Consider the building entrances, the travel paths, the parking lots, the sidewalks, the playgrounds. All of those things, look for safety. And if you've got a church and you've got questions, don't be bashful. Ask. If you see a church down the street that just built a brand new playground outside and you're thinking about remodeling yours, go down there and look. Spend some time. The best time spent is in learning, not repairing or trying to care for something that happened. So consider your building utilities as you look at budgeting. Consider the kitchen and the cooking areas. What's safe? What's not? Do we have fire protection? Is there a building security system? You know, people meet at night. Sun goes down early in the winter. You want to be certain that there's security around the building. What if there's a tornado blowing through? Do you have a plan of where the people go? What if there's an earthquake? Do you have plans of where you know it's structurally sound? Do you have a meeting place outside? Do you have a cemetery attached to your property? The biggest problem with cemeteries are the trips and falls. People will step into the dirt, the high heels will sink down, men's shoes will go into the mud. You turn, you fall, you break a hip, and now you've injured another good person that was attending the funeral at that cemetery. So watch your cemeteries. Watch limbs that are hanging over from trees that have dead limbs in them over your fences that are going to break the headstones, that are going to break your fence down. Check everything. Just look to see what's wrong. Remember, you do all these things at home. You make sure that your home is safe, sound, and secure. Shouldn't you have even a greater responsibility to be sure that God's house is safe, sound, and secure? So do an informal assessment or get somebody to come in and do a formal assessment. Whatever you do, make sure you're doing something. Be certain that you are looking at this property. And if you have vehicles, be sure you've got a management plan over who drives. Your drivers of your vehicles can be your asset, your best asset, or your worst liability. Last thing you need is somebody that drives way over the speed limit, driving your van, carrying all your precious cargo, the children, the youth, the older adults, whoever, driving fast out there, getting speeding tickets, causing accidents. You want to be certain that you've got requirements for who drives. You want to be certain you've got a risk management over how is that vehicle maintained and when was it maintained. You want to think through that. I need a pre-trip vehicle inspection for the person driving to sign off on. Kind of like when you rent a car from Hertz or Budget or Alamo or one of them, you always have to sign off on it. have the driver sign off on it with an employee of the church so that we know that we're sending out a safe vehicle in good condition. Watch your preventive maintenance and make sure you know who has keys to everything laying out there. If I got a key, I've got access. If I've got access, I've got responsibility. So be sure those that have keys are those that you want to have responsibility for God's house on your property. Last thing I want to talk about is incorporation of the local church. And I was telling you the story about the little child that stepped in the fire ant bed. Here's what happened. They were unincorporated. What happens when you're unincorporated and you get sued? The trustees get named. Well, it turned out that this child's grandmother was a trustee. So the lawsuit was filed against, among 8 other people, and the child's grandmother. That's a sad occasion when that has to happen. And we tried to get the grandmother out of it, and the law would not allow it because the trustees were responsible. Another thing that can happen, you're jointly and severably liable, which means simply this. If all of us can't pay for it, whoever's got enough money to pay for it's got to pay for it. That's jointly we share, or severally I get to pay by myself. So we're jointly and severably liable. The discipline simply says that no individual should be held responsible for acts of the church. Now, help the law understand that a United Methodist can't be held liable. That's not going to happen, folks. The best way to be sure that our trustees are held not liable in situations, as long as they're doing what they're supposed to do, by being incorporated. If I incorporate my trustees, the legal body. They have to meet once a year, the corporation does. That's January. There's already a set schedule for that. They elect their own officers, and they're responsible for everything that happens inside those buildings, the property, as well as all of the contracts and all those other things. So if I'm incorporated and a lawsuit is brought, it's brought against the trustees of the church, which then does keep you from being held personally liable. So it's important. Think through this incorporation bit. Every church should be incorporated. There's plenty of guidance on the website that will get you through that. Basically, take that, read through that, fill in the blocks, and they're easy to fill in, and then sit down with an attorney that understands incorporations of not-for-profits and hopefully churches. To get your church incorporated, have it set, get everything in place, and then act like a corporation. Have your corporate meeting every January, have your elections, do all the things you're supposed to do so that you're not just in name only, because what happens there is the judge will kick out an in-name only corporation because you haven't prudently acted as you're supposed to. You can be sued if you know that there's a big hole out in the driveway that a car could run into and tear it up, and you don't fix it. That is not acting prudently. So we must act prudently. We must do what needs to be done, care for God's house, and as the trustees, be the responsible party for all of the things that happen inside that church. So you see, you got a lot of work to do. Now, the trustees have got a guidebook, Guidelines for the Trustees, Manage the Resources of the Congregation. I would suggest that I would get one of these. I would have every trustee read it, and then right in the front of the book, I'd have them sign and date when they read it. This gives me 2 things. One, I know the trustee has read the book and knows what their job is. But number 2, if I end up in court and they say, have you given proper training? I'm going to say, yes. We read the book, we worked together, we've done training, here's what we went through, and we are sure that everybody's reading the rules. So you see, it's pretty easy as you work through it to say we'll do the things. The hard part is to do them. Now the trustees, as we talked about, relate to the property of the church. Now the parsonage is where the pastor lives. And so inside that parsonage, we need to be sure that we're caring for that. And that begins to move to the conference trustees with input from the conference trustees and the local church trustees, and they begin to work together. And over the past year, we've been very fortunate to have a person come in to work with me as the and I get this name wrong every time, but he's the administrative assistant over trustee matters for the conference. And Mitchell Hedgepeth serves in that position. Mitchell and I have been friends for many, many years, and this working relationship has really been neat. Mitchell has helped work through a good parsonage policy. He's helped us realize what we need to do and what we need to have to make it comfortable for the pastor and livable for the pastors, probably more importantly. Then he's also helped in moving those pastors from one place to the other, and then he provided what was necessary to be able to have the proof that we've done what we want to do. So in the next session, Mitchell's going to carry you through that parsonage policy, that moving policy, and the parsonage forms that all become very important to you mainly as the conference trustees, but is very, very helpful to the Pastor Parish Relations Committee. So Mitchell, come talk to him.